headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador. This is From the South, and I'm Camila Escalante. We begin in Brazil, where the Supreme Court has upheld a decision that may mean the release of up to 70% of those detained through the Lava Jato case because of coerced testimony. Our correspondent in Sao Paulo, Brian Muir, has the details.
Tonight, the Supreme Court just upheld a decision from the Second Working Group from last Wednesday, which, if it's carried through properly, will end up reversing around 70% of the convictions in the now disgraced Lava Jato investigation, which was overseen by the current Justice Minister, former Judge Sergio Moro, who's been revealed through The Intercept, through these leaked Telegram conversations, to have collaborated illegally with prosecution to put the former President Lula in jail, even though they knew they had no evidence against him. This ruling by the Supreme Court means that in cases where plea bargain testimony was coerced, where they arrested businessmen and then only let them out of jail after they changed their testimony, which appears to be the case in around 70% of the Lava Jato convictions, the defendant has to have the right to the final word of defense. And this wasn't respected in many of the cases, including Lula's second conviction over the Itaibaya vacation property. So, although it doesn't have direct effect on Lula getting out of jail, for example, soon in the near future, it's just one more thing that's discrediting the entire Lava Jato investigation. As pressure builds from all over the world to free Lula, it's just one more chink in this defense of this investigation that's basically now been proven to be indefensible.
Iran has reiterated its willingness to resume talks about its nuclear deal, but blamed the United States for sabotaging the process by threatening the country with sanctions. Iran's President Hassan Rouhani had said that he welcomes a plan for talks presented to the United States and Iran by French President Emmanuel Macron. However, he pointed out that mixed messages regarding sanctions received from the United States during the UN General Assembly in New York last week undermine the possibility.
They wanted to pretend. They wanted to make up a symbolic state of Iran surrendering and force the president of our country to meet. They even begged for it. They even made their European friends meddle. They all came and went and failed until the end.
Russian President Vladimir Putin has shot down United States accusations that Iran was responsible for an attack on Saudi oil infrastructure last month. Putin said that there was no evidence that Iran was responsible for an attack and challenged the United States to present any proof of Iran's participation. The attacks knocked out more than half of the top global oil exporters' output. Yemen's Houthi fighters claimed responsibility, but U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo swiftly accused Iran, threatening military action. Tehran has rejected the allegations.
These attacks don't deliver proper results to those who planned them, but instead do harm to the global economy, including the consumers. That is why we condemn it. However, we are against shifting the blame to Iran, because there is no proof of that.
Former Dallas police officer Amber Geiger has been sentenced to 10 years in prison for the murder of St. Lucian national Botham Jean. Meanwhile, in the halls of the courtroom, protesters expressed anger and outrage over the sentencing, shouting, "No justice, no peace." And this is wrong. The jury had the option to sentence Geiger to life in prison or as little as 5 years behind bars for murdering Jean on September 6, 2018. And still in the United States, the president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, has been accused of receiving campaign finance donations from drug traffickers on the opening day of his brother, Tony Hernandez's trial for drug trafficking and other crimes taking place in New York.
Today is the first day of the trial against José Antonio Hernandez, better known as Tony Hernandez, the brother of the president, Juan Orlando Hernandez. The most important part of the day was the accusations against the Honduran leader, stating that he received $1 million from Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, as well as other amounts of money from different criminal groups in order to finance his political campaigns. Among all of this, we have to remember that Tony Hernandez is being investigated for drug trafficking, falsification of testimony, and trafficking arms, and beyond this, the murder of 2 people. What's to be expected now is the presentation of evidence against Mr. Tony Hernandez and the presentation of the other people that have been accused in the case, including Mr. Alexander Ardon, who was the mayor of El Paraíso in the west of Honduras. Also accused is Juan Orlando Hernandez, so there are a number of authority figures involved in the case.
Haitian police fired live rounds to disperse protesters as thousands took to the streets once again of Port-au-Prince, demanding President Jovenel Moïse to step down. Several protesters have been injured as police in riot gear clashed with demonstrators. For several months now, Haitians have been in the streets calling for Moïse to resign. He's blamed for the country's economic crisis, which has been made worse by fuel shortages. The country's grappling with inflation and corruption accusations against public officials.
I am out of a job and hungry. I cannot wait anymore. Jovenel Moïse needs to step down, no matter how he wants us to force him to resign.
Trinidad and Tobago's Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley says the country is being pressured by international forces keen on staging military intervention in Venezuela. Dr. Rowley said this is evident by international publications which negatively portray Trinidad's handling of the Venezuelan migrant issue.
I tell you this so you can understand that the whole issue of the security of the region is not to be taken for granted, because there are powerful forces engaged in seeking to bring about military intervention as a solution to political problems. Now, the kinds of pressure that is brought to bear in Trinidad and Tobago by persons known and unknown, countries known and unknown, is known to the government. Might not be known to you, the media, but we know who we are dealing with and what we're dealing with. And we conduct the business of Trinidad and Tobago. And that is why when we saw people misrepresenting our receipt of refugees, we know what that means. We know what that means for Trinidad and Tobago. To portray us as a country harboring or receiving or bad treating a number of refugees from Venezuela is all part of this whole question of how do we get done what we want to get done.
Proclamations for Guyana's general and regional elections have been issued by the country's president, David Granger. The head of state made the proclamation in keeping with Article 61 of the Constitution. Last week, President Granger named March 22, 2020 as the date for the holding of a general and regional elections. The much anticipated announcement came months after legal wrangling on election issues following the passage of last December's no confidence motion against the government.
Mr. Rohi.
On the heels of her return from the UN Climate Action Summit, Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley has called on citizens to help the country meet the target of being free of fossil fuels by 2030. Mottley made the call at the Barbados Sustainable Energy Conference 2019.
Our reserves are at 1,225.6 million today. Now, the bottom line is that once oil prices go back up, the biggest claim on those reserves and then the functioning of this economy is in fact the price of oil, both for electricity and for the transport sector. Now, Barbadians have, therefore, not government, Barbadians as a whole have to transition over the course of the next decade to vehicles that are powered primarily by electric. Some may eventually be powered by new forms of technology, some known and unknown. There are some who might prefer to be powered by hydrogen. But whatever it is, the bottom line is that the days of a fossil fuel-driven economy are going to have to be put behind us.
After the break, we'll discuss the Ecuadorian government's economic reforms with Congresswoman Esther Cuesta Santana. Don't go away. Welcome back. Ecuador's President Lenín Moreno has announced a sweeping package of economic measures to cut the public deficit. In an address to the nation, Moreno said he would not raise the VAT as many had expected he would, but he's removing all subsidies on fuels, which is likely to raise the prices of many goods and services. And he said labor reforms would be announced to make hiring and firing easier. The president said the measures were needed to create jobs, but various social organizations have rejected the measures, describing the package as a classic IMF-inspired structural adjustment.
We are here to strongly reject the neoliberal policies of the government of Lenín Moreno. Ecuadorians, it is time to come together, to join forces in order to provide guidelines to the disastrous government of Moreno.
The economic measures implemented by President Moreno are clearly in complicity with the International Monetary Fund, but also with businessmen. Today they are celebrating because the labor reform that is coming is not trying to resolve the workers' right or unemployment. What it is trying to do is worsen the workers' conditions.
And Ecuador's National Federation of Transport Workers has announced that if the government does not repeal the executive order which eliminates the gas subsidy, they will suspend transport services throughout the country tonight at midnight.
Well, tomorrow, unfortunately, there will not any service, not only in the transport sector for passengers, but for all modes of transportation. This is a consequence of the mismanagement of the economy.
Here now in studio is Esther Cuesta Santana. She's a Citizens Revolution Congresswoman and a representative of migrants in Europe. Thank you so much for being here. Protests are going on right now here in Quito, largely against the paquetazo. Who will this affect? What will this affect? And why is the president making this decision?
Well, thank you for having me here. First of all, these economic measures will really affect the middle class, the popular classes, the working class, the small businesses, basically because by increasing the price of oil, of diesel, necessarily everything will increase. That means the food will increase, the prices will increase of the food, of transportation, of passengers, of our cargo, and obviously the workers will have less money to consume. The salaries will decrease. The president announced also that the salaries will be decreased by 20%, which is a lot for workers and particularly for workers in the public service. The mobilization is extending all over the country. It started in the province of Carchi for a series of reasons of abandonment by the government, not fulfilling the promises. And now it's really increasing to Quito, to Bolivar, to Sucumbíos. And what we see is this spontaneous resistance of citizens. We will not accept all these political measures that will impoverish people, impoverish, again, the middle classes, the working classes, and the most vulnerable people in our country.
Absolutely. And also announced was the labor reforms last evening. Tell us a bit about that and who will benefit from those.
Well, the benefit for these measures will evidently be big corporations, private corporations. What the president intends to do is debilitate the state, debilitate the institutionalization of the state that we had consolidated during the government of President Rafael Correa by decreasing the salaries of public officials, by giving this flexibilization of contracts. What we're doing is that the best workers may leave the country. The best workers may not come to the public service. And this is also affecting the economy, and I would say it's very demagogic. The president said yesterday that he will not increase the VAT, which is, let's not be surprised that it will be increased in the next few months, maybe next year, because it's part of the compromises that the government made with the IMF.
Absolutely. And so we just played a clip from the transport workers who are set to strike at midnight. What other actions do you think we'll see from workers? Do you think the public sector in what ways will the public sector organize around this?
Well, last night the president said very clearly that 23,000 public officials were fired. That means, if you calculate 5 people per every family. You know, we're talking about thousands of people. Tomorrow we will have a mobilization of people. We, as the Citizens Revolution bloc in the National Assembly, we delivered a press conference today, and in which we, you know, abiding by the Constitution, we have the right of resistance. And this is what we're doing. We are resisting these neoliberal policies which are benefiting big corporations, particularly the exporters, the importers. You know, the president said, well, we're gonna cut the taxes for iPhones and laptops and iPads, but if people will not have the money to buy milk, to buy eggs, to buy chicken, to buy meat, forget they will have the money to buy an iPhone that can cost $850. It's impossible. It's really demagogic.
Let's go back to something you mentioned earlier, the protests in the north of the country. What exactly is that about? Because here in the mainstream media, we're actually not seeing a whole lot of that, but it's apparently, you know, whole road blockages that are making it difficult for people to travel from Quito, for example, up to that border with Colombia. What is going on there?
Well, I'm glad you're mentioning this, because the hegemonic media is trying to invisibilize people's mobilization and people's marches in Carchi that has more than a week now. What we see now is that there is an increased police violence. We have had, if I remember correctly, more than 14 people detained. There are many people who are injured during these protests, and the media is minimizing, I would say, the strength, the resistance, and particularly the organization of people of Carchi. I think the Carchenses, the Carchi people, are really leading these protests that I would say will increase at a national level with the economic measures announced last night.
So something really interesting happening right now, very significant, we're just getting a chance to talk about today, but was also recently announced, is Ecuador is leaving OPEC. President Moreno announced that Ecuador will be withdrawing from the organization at the start of next year. Why was that decision made?
Well, you know, Ecuador's decision to leave OPEC really has, I would say, 3 major economic, political, and environmental implications. First, it continues the tendency of isolating Ecuador in a multilateral world, in a multipolar world. And it will also, you know, will leave Ecuador in a more fragile, in a more vulnerable position to negotiate with big oil transnational corporations, and also with other countries with big economies. Could be the US, Russia, China, even the European Union. So this decision really isolates Ecuador in a similar way that the government and the National Assembly recently took the decision of leaving UNASUR, right? Which means renouncing the possibility of having Quito, the capital of Ecuador, as the capital of South America, as the capital of the South American integration. The economic implication, I would say, it has to do with the bilateral investment treaties that Ecuador will be probably signing in the next few months, which means that it is no coincidence that after a year, through the President Moreno signed a presidential decree 499, I think, in July 2018. And in this decree 449, what happened? It reverted the profits that could get the oil corporations. During the government of President Rafael Correa, we inverted that. What I'm saying is that oil corporations would get big profits. The state, that means all Ecuadorians, will get 80% of the royalties of this oil production. And 20% would get the oil corporations. We renegotiated these contracts, and the big corporations still made a lot of money because most of them stayed. But with this presidential decree in July of 2008, this was reverted. And obviously, it was in favor of these oil corporations that were in charge of the oil production in Ecuador. So this, by not having the ceiling of oil supply that Ecuador had to abide by OPEC, what happens, we may have the possibility of increasing our oil supply, our oil production, more than 500,000 barrels per day, but that money, that increase in the barrels will not go to the Ecuadorian people. It will go to the big corporations. So it will not go toward infrastructure, to education, to health, but to go to big corporations. And the third implication is probably the most terrifying in a global climate change agenda. These big corporations in Ecuador have created enormous damages in our Amazon. And these corporations like Chevron, like Oxy, Ecuador had to pay to Oxy in 2016 $980 million. And then recently we had to pay to Chevron more than $112 million. So what I'm saying is, it's a kind of servilism that the government of Ecuador is taking toward transnational corporations, mostly from the United States. And of course, the environmental damages that have caused to the Amazon in a lawsuit that was presented by indigenous communities that were affected by this contamination, there was not be any repair.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. We're short on time. Otherwise, I would ask you more questions about leaving UNASUR, what they're doing with the building, the Nestor Kirchner statue, very important to a lot of people in our audience. But we're all out of time. We've been speaking to Esther Cuesta Santana. She is from the Citizens Revolution in Congress and a representative of migrants in Europe, here with us in studio. Quick break and then some news from Somalia.